Hello! Today, we're breaking down the economic aspects of what's happening in Venezuela. Because when politicians talk about overthrowing a regime, they don't talk about what matters most, money. About how a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves became dirt poor. And how now Trump is deploying troops and trying to rebuild it. This is a story of economic collapse and probable revival. A story that shows how you can lose everything even when you have everything. And how geopolitics penetrates every economic decision. Subscribe to the channel because economics is what moves the world. How Venezuela became the richest country. Let's start by understanding where the story begins. In the early 2000s, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in Latin America. Why? Oil. The country sits on 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. These are the world's largest reserves. Saudi Arabia? 260 billion. Russia? 30 billion. Venezuela has 3 times more than Russia. In the 2000s, Venezuela was pumping 3 million barrels of oil per day. That's serious volume. On the global market, oil cost $140 per barrel. If you multiply 3 million barrels by $100, you get $300 million per day. Just from oil, $300 million per day. This meant the state was getting $9 billion per month, just from oil. There were virtually no other income sources. 90% of state revenue came from oil. With this money, Venezuela built cities, paid salaries, invested in social programs. With this money, politicians made trillions through corruption. Because when a state has this much money and no oversight, everything becomes corruption. But back then, it seemed this would last forever. Oil wouldn't run out. Venezuela was rich, right? When the collapse began, everything changed in 2013. Hugo Chavez died. The revolutionary leader, the man who ruled Venezuela for 15 years. Power passed to his successor, Nicolas Maduro. An ordinary politician without Chavez's charisma. And in that same year, something happened that destroyed the entire economy. Oil prices fell, just fell, from $100 per barrel to $40, $50. Now calculate, if before 3 million barrels brought $300 million per day, now they bring $150 million. That's half the income. But Maduro ruled the same way. He distributed money, paid bills, did the same thing. That's when the crisis began. Because the state depended on oil 90%. Everything else was abandoned. There was no manufacturing. Agriculture was destroyed. Light industry didn't exist. Everything ran on oil money. And when the oil money ran out, everything ran out. Maduro did what all helpless politicians do in such situations. He printed money. Just printed it. Income isn't coming in. Let's print money. That's the logic. The result? Hyperinflation. Currency became worthless. Salaries every few months became worth nothing. The economic apocalypse. By 2020, Venezuela had experienced economic apocalypse. Let's look at the numbers. GDP fell 80% in a few years. 80%. That's worse than the Great Depression in the US. Hyperinflation reached 1,000% per year. Your money was worth 1,000 times less. Minimum wage fell from $300 per month to $2-3 per month. You heard that right. $2 or $3 for the entire month. To buy bread, you needed piles of currency notes. People were eating from garbage, literally. Hunger became common. Healthcare collapsed. Hospitals had no medicine or equipment. Education fell apart. Teachers weren't paid, schools were closing. And most importantly, the oil sector started degrading. Why? Because Maduro didn't invest in its development. Instead of modernizing equipment, fixing wells, updating technology, he just took the money and handed it out. Oil production fell from 3 million barrels per day to 300,000. That's 10 times less. A tenfold decline. Because wells degraded, pipelines broke, refineries are rusting, technicians fled because they weren't paid. Everything in ruins. When the Russians and Chinese arrived. But then geopolitics intervened. When Venezuela collapsed economically, it didn't disappear. Instead, Maduro started looking for help, and he found it with Russia and China. Russia, through Rosneft, started controlling Venezuela's oil sector. They invested money, took oil as payment. This was the system that kept the regime afloat. In exchange, Russia got control over the country's energy and a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. China went further. It gave Venezuela $19 billion in loans, $19 billion. In exchange, Venezuela paid with oil. Every day, Venezuela sent oil tankers to China as payment for the debt. These were huge investments, not from goodness, from interest. China got energy and debt dependency over Venezuela. If you owe someone billions, you do what they say. So Venezuela ended up under Russian and Chinese control. Americans watch this with horror. In their own hemisphere, their main geopolitical enemies control one of the largest countries. Why Trump invaded right now? And then 2026 arrived. Trump returned to the White House with one strategy: take back the hemisphere. In late 2025, the Trump administration published a national security strategy. It clearly stated the Western Hemisphere is priority number one. Not Europe, not Asia, the hemisphere. And this means no Russians, no Chinese in the Caribbean. On January 3, 2026, at 2 a.m., American troops entered Venezuela. They captured Maduro. Quick, clean, no losses. Why did Trump do this? Let's break down the economics. Trump's economic logic. First, Venezuelan oil, 300 billion barrels. Enormous wealth. If you restore production to just 2 million barrels per day, that's U.S. energy security for the next 100 years. It means American oil companies will make trillions. ExxonMobil and Chevron historically controlled Venezuela's oil sector before Chavez's revolution. They want to return. And they're very close to Trump. Oil companies, they're his people. They invested millions in his campaign. Second, energy independence. If the U.S. controls Venezuelan oil, they don't depend on OPEC, don't depend on Saudi Arabia, don't depend on anyone. They control the global energy market themselves through controlling the Western Hemisphere. Third, money for voters. When an additional 2 million barrels of Venezuelan oil appear on the global market, oil prices fall. This means Americans pay less for gasoline, and that's very popular politically. Fourth, jobs. Rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector requires enormous investment, tens of billions of dollars. Who'll do this? American companies, and they'll hire American workers. Jobs in Texas, Louisiana, other states. Fifth, taxes. When oil companies make trillions, they pay taxes. Federal, state, local. This is income for the government. Sixth, geopolitics. Venezuela is no longer a Russian and Chinese outpost. It becomes a U.S. outpost. And this will let Trump control all of Latin America. No U.S. enemies can have influence in the hemisphere. What does the new government mean? When a new government arrives, what does it do with the economy? The opposition government, led by Maria Corina Machado, promises reforms. says there will be privatization, openness to Western companies, oil sector restoration. Here's their plan: currency stabilization, stop printing money, restore confidence in the money system. Reforms at PDVSA, the National Oil Company, clean it from corruption, invite Western companies, modernize. Attracting foreign investment. Exxon, Chevron, and other energy giants will come with money and experience. Restoring oil production. Goal: return to 2 to 3 million barrels per day in 10 years. Diversify the economy. Develop agriculture, industry, tourism. On paper, it sounds good, but in practice, real numbers for reconstruction. Rebuilding Venezuela will cost money, lots of money. The oil sector degraded completely. To get it working, replace outdated equipment, $20 to $30 billion. Repair pipelines, $10–15 billion. Modernize refineries, $15–20 billion. Retrain workers and specialists, $2–3 billion. Total, $5,100 billion, and that's minimum, for 10 years of work. Where does this money come from? Option 1. Western companies. Exxon and Chevron have experience in Venezuela and capital. They'll return, but only if there's stability. Option 2. International loans. The IMF, World Bank can provide money with conditions for reforms. Option 3. Neighbors and U.S. alliances. If the U.S. says help Venezuela, neighbors will help. Debt and problems. But there's a problem. Venezuela owes China $19 billion. How will it pay? The new government could declare default. Just not pay. This ruins credit rating but gives more oil for export. Or they negotiate with the West. The West says, we help you, you break contracts with China. Venezuela agrees. And Western companies return, Chinese ones leave. This is geopolitical war through economics. Who controls the debts, controls the country? Economic winners. If reconstruction works, everyone wins. The U.S. gets Venezuelan oil, energy security, control over the hemisphere, geopolitical dominance, jobs for American workers, taxes from oil companies, exclusion of Russia and China from the region. Venezuela gets oil revenue, billions per year. Jobs, reconstruction needs hundreds of thousands of workers. Recovery of social services, healthcare, education. Integration into Western economy. Stability and prosperity. Western companies get contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. Access to cheap energy. Prosperity for decades. But it depends on one thing. If the government doesn't steal the money, if it spends it on development. History shows this is unlikely. Because in Venezuela there are colectivos, there are criminal networks, there are people used to stealing state money. 10–20 years of conflict ahead. Conclusion. Venezuela's story is a lesson in economics and geopolitics together, a lesson that when you have one source of wealth, you're vulnerable. When oil prices fall, your economy falls. A lesson that when your economy collapses, you become vulnerable to interference. Russia and China came to Venezuela because the economy was broken, and they controlled it through debt. A lesson that Trump doesn't act from altruism. He acts from interest. Venezuelan oil benefits American companies, and Trump protects his people's interests. And a lesson that reconstruction is harder than collapse. Reconstruction takes decades. And it's not guaranteed to work. Venezuela is a laboratory example, and we'll watch what happens in the next 10 years. Will this be successful reconstruction or another failed occupation that the U.S. eventually abandons? If you liked this video, subscribe and turn on notifications. Economics is what moves the world. And when you understand economics, you understand why countries invade each other. You understand the real reasons behind politics and wars. See you next time.